All right, welcome back to the channel. Got a lot of progress since the last episode. We're going to take a look at that a little bit later. I'm going to show all the foam that I have in place now, kind of, inside so you can see all the work that I've done. And really, all the work was for these parking sensors. Um, you can see I already have measurements down there, and the kind of step-by-step for this episode is going to be mounting these things. We're going to do it in like the step-by-step, from measurements, which I really haven't talked a lot about measurements yet, but we're going to get into that one. We're going to go from measurements to cutting out foam. Yep, we're going to actually have to cut out foam because we need a space for these mounting brackets. From there, we're going to lay fiberglass, and we're going to also bond everything, an outer skin to these body panels here to, mount these things. So we got a lot to get into this episode. Hopefully, people understand why I went to the lengths I went to create these sections. I could, if I didn't have these parking sensors, I could have done this in a much simpler way. But because we have, modern technology, we got to work with it. And, keeping the car functioning like OEM is really important to me in like regards to my builds. So although, I am modifying the car, I am also trying to keep as much of the original car intact as possible. So having said all that, we're going to get into a little bit of walk around here so you can see, the work that I've done. From there, we're going to get into the step-by-step how-to, starting with the measurements. So, yep, let's go check out the video. Okay, starting with the rear wheel well here, you can see how I added that upper section of foam at the top in combination with this lower one right here. So now looking in, this entire section here is sealed off. Once my trim panel goes across, that it will protect everything. You can see way in the back, there's my pilot hole for dead center of my parking sensor. That's where it's going to go. We'll get into the measurements a little bit later. So now you can see how the port down here is completely separated from this section up here. And that idea was basically part of the design of the car, building this pocket, into here. So we'll take a look at the other side. So again, here we have this upper triangular section of foam that creates, this sealed cavity. We'll just add a trim panel here. There's nothing to protect, but it, has to look good. You can see everything's been soaked out in resin, like the other foam. So that's pretty much that looks like. We'll look at the front. All right, here we are on the front end. You can see up in there, we've got the foam. All three sections, just like the rear. This section will get a trim panel, no sensor. We'll look at the other side. This is the side that will actually get the sensor, and you can see that little tiny sliver of foam up in there. That was a real treat to get in. There's not a lot of room in here. You can see right there is my pilot hole. So, taking away the foam for that mounting bracket is definitely necessary up in the front end. Let's take a look under the hood. So here we are under the hood, and you can see we have this section right here that I added foam. And down in here. Now there is a little bit of an opening in here, and I haven't decided what I'll do with that yet. Figure it out later on. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about in the how-to is basically how I came up with this line here, which there's a lot of different ways you can do it, But for me, really, I wanted to be level off of this parking sensor. I'm going to try and do all this without getting in the way of the camera. So, you know, if my Sasquatch arms get in the way, I apologize. So basically, all these sensors run pretty much level on the car as far as I can tell. So I wanted to make sure that this sensor over here was also level. The other thing that I had to consider was that I want to do a trim panel on the inside, and I had to make sure that the mounting bracket for the sensor was positioned back far enough that I wouldn't interfere. So, you know, knowing all that information, you know, determining level for the sensor or where the position should be was my first, you know, starting point really. So what I did was I marked center right here on the existing parking sensor and bumper. And I took my steel rule and a level. And what I did was held this up and used my rule to find level. And where that intersects with the body panel, I simply made a dot. And from there, I was able to walk and make, you know, a series of dots that established a line. From there, I was just able to, you know, take a straight edge and create this line. So that's basically how I came up with the height here. I've already done it on the other side of the car, and when we do the process of doing everything else, we'll go over there and do it, but I'll show you over there. But I just wanted to explain it over here first. So that was basically how we established the height here. The next thing that I needed to know was how far did I have to come in? And you can see right here, well, you probably can't see it on the camera, but it's actually 9, which is centimeters. I like to use a fabric tape in a lot of measuring when I do this stuff because these body panels roll. So a steel rule, you can't really bend it to get precise measurements. So what I wanted to determine was from the center of this round rod here, how far in could I come, you know, the maximum distance here. I determined that was 9 centimeters. And I'll show you how I did it. So once I found on the inside, basically this position, I was able to take this measurement, and I can't really see, there we go. And when I wrap this tape, 9 centimeters is on the center of this round rod. So knowing this measurement, I can transfer that to the other side. And then the next measurement that we had to do was this 1/4 inch. So what I wanted to do is make sure from the edge of the mounting bracket that there was enough space that I can add a trim panel. So giving myself a 1/4 inch gap between the back side of a trim panel is plenty of room. That was a simple mark, you know, just use a steel rule, come over a 1/4 inch, make a line. But from there, I wanted to determine where the dead center of the parking sensor was. From there, it was basically just measuring the mounting bracket, finding center, and putting that into place. And that was 1 inch and 7/16 from here to here. That pretty much took care of centering up, you know, height and distance back to get the parking sensor where I want it. And so now what we'll do is go to the other side and I'll kind of show you the step-by-step process of what we're going to do next. I already have all these lines laid out over there, but it will be starting with drilling a pilot hole. And then we will be laying aluminum tape, and then we will be moving on to fiberglass. So let's get to it. Okay, so we're on the other side of the car here, and you can see that I already have all my measurements done on this side. And really, what the main point again was just to find center of this mounting bracket. And you can see when I center this up, that's essentially how this thing's going to sit. Yep. Obviously, it'll be reversed like this, so it sits flat. And this little section right here, I'll be able to cut that off. So in reference, this is, the size of a note card basically is what we're going to be going for with fiberglass. So we're going to be making a fiberglass skin that will be bonded to the outside of this panel because I need to make room clearance-wise. And so what we're going to have to do is cut out this foam right here. So the first step, really, after our measurements, is going to be drill a pilot hole. This will establish that dead center. I have this, it's a little woodworking, I don't know what they call it, but I love it for pilot holes. So we'll just drill a pilot hole through the foam just in case we lose any of our measurements during any of like the fiberglass or whatever, we have it. So there's our pilot hole. The next step that we're going to be doing is to lay our aluminum tape. And if you watched, previous episodes, you know that I use this a lot for, fiberglass and protecting surfaces, but also mimicking surfaces. So what I want to do is duplicate the way that this panel is laying right now so that the fiberglass skin can then be bonded and retain the same shape. I'm going to be putting more fiberglass over this, so I will be able to feather this out. And when I cover it with more fiberglass, I'll be able to kind of blend it. So it won't be a big deal. But the idea is just that we have to create a mounting surface, to take away this foam. And this is the best way to do it for me. So I'm just going to take my aluminum tape, and again, I'm just going to tape off a section that's slightly bigger than a note card. Now with this, I do want, a slight overlap on the tape because I do not want that resin that I'm laying to bond to this foam. This step right here is one of the reasons that I added resin to this foam, It's not like super rigid by any means, but there's just enough rigidity that I can do stuff like this, like put aluminum tape and, you know, create a little panel if I need to. It's just, you know, part of my process. All right, so now I have this aluminum tape down, and I can go ahead and prepare my fiberglass mat and my resin. I'm going to do all that. I won't be able to talk over that, so if there's any kind of information, I'll just do a voiceover. But before I lay the fiberglass, you can see this line right here. And I purposely made this line long, knowing that I was going to have to lay this glass mat over this aluminum tape. I'm going to get a piece of fiberglass mat, and it's going to be my 2-ounce mat. And I'm going to just tear a section that's a little bit bigger than this note card. And when I look at this line, if I know that I center it, basically like this, I'll be fine. Once this dries, I'll be able to pull it off, pull the tape, put this back up, then I'll be able to actually, you know, figure out where the pilot hole is going to be. I can, you know, bond drill, all that other stuff. So, you know, this is just, you know, part of getting to get this thing mounted. So we're going to get to fiberglass next. So our next step is going to be remove this fiberglass that we let dry. The real easy way for me to do this is just to pull some of the tape from the corner, and then I'll just use a razor blade and release the piece. So there's our, our little piece. You can see how I kind of retained the shape of the piece where we laid it up. So now we can pull the tape, and the next step will be to put our pilot hole in our fiberglass. So what I want to do next is find the center for my pilot hole here. And the easiest way for me is basically going to be two things. I'm going to extend my center lines for two reasons. One, it will help establish center on this panel, but it'll also give me alignment points that I can mark on this panel, because we are going to have to cut all this foam out to make room for the sensor bracket. So when this foam is removed, I want to be able to relocate this easily by putting this on. So what I'm going to do is extend all my center lines. Now when I hold my fiberglass piece in place, you can see it's very easy for me to mark this, to find center, and also to realign this panel when I'm done. So we're just going to tape it in place and transfer our lines. And the fiberglass itself, it falls right into place, basically where I had it laid up. So it's not like there's a lot of guesswork as to where it goes. Oops, something in the neighborhood just fired up. Sounded pretty good. All right, so now you can see through the fiberglass, it's really transparent. And I can see exactly where my center point is. At this point, I really could just drill my pilot hole and call it a day if I wanted to, but I want to be able, like I said, to get the dead center of this sensor the same on both sides of the car. So having this panel very accurate in location makes that critical. So by extending these lines now through this panel before I drill my pilot hole, it will help to ensure that if I take this off and put it back on, I can do it 1,000 times and I'll always be able to put it exactly in the same spot again. I mean, within, decimal points of accuracy. Okay, so now from here, I'll just drill my pilot hole. And again, I'm using this little pilot hole. I don't know what they are. I really like them though for pilot holes. Could be even what it's for. I don't know. All right, now we're just going to go straight on through. And that was a pretty much clean shot right through the pilot hole I already had in the foam. So, you know, when you're going through, you would feel if it was, you know, off in any direction. Plus, there was no movement in the panel. So to say that that was a really good, you know, straight shot to where I already had it, it's a safe assumption. At this point, we're going to take this off. From there, we're going to trace our bracket, figure out our dimensions to cut out the foam, and then we will cut out the foam. So we're moving on to this sensor bracket, and this is kind of, you know, a really good look at it. This is essentially how it will be sitting, although it would be reverse inside the vehicle. I'm going to have to remove this little wire keeper. I have no need for it. It's just going to get in the way for me. But so what we're going to do now is figure out where we want to cut out the foam. I need this bracket to sit flush with this surface. If I were to mount this from the backside of the foam, like with the foam intact, there's not enough of the sensor that would actually stick through this bracket to come to the surface or even remotely close to flush. So I don't want it countersunk. I think it would look like trash, and I honestly don't know how it would affect the sensor's capabilities for working. So what I'm going to do is bring the bracket to flush with this surface, and when that bracket or the sensor actually sticks through, that will give me an 1/8 inch. That 1/8 inch is pretty much what I wanted to build up in my material surface on the outside here. So by bringing this bracket all the way forward to this flush area, we will now be able to lay our fiberglass. So that's essentially why I'm doing everything in this step. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put this thing in place, tape it in place, kind of eyeball it, center it. From there, we'll trace it, and then we can take that measurement or that trace line and extend a 1/4 inch all the way around so that we have plenty of room for this thing. Now, people might be like, well, how would you locate it if you make it so much larger? Dead center of the parking sensor has already been located in my fiberglass panel. So when I transfer my panel back over, I can drill that dead center out to 23/32, which is the sensor actual dimension, and have it pop through. So we'll get into all of it, but I just wanted to explain it. So yeah, here we go. So there's openings on the bottom and little tooling marks made in the plastics that I can use as guidelines to eyeball this thing. And again, eyeballing it right here is fine. This is not a crazy critical measurement. This is probably one of the very few times where you'd see me just say, eyeball it. All right. So now all I need really is reference lines. I can do the rest with a straight rule. Yep. All right. So you can see these lines right here make up that bracket. Basically now we'll just play connect the dots. Now this quarter inch measurement I already had established previously. If you remember, I said that was that distance that I wanted to keep for the inside of a trim panel. So now here is our bracket. From here, we are going to extend all these lines out a quarter inch. So for me, I'll just line up on my quarter and my quarter, mark my line. This line's already established. Same thing here. And up top. These fine tip markers don't wear very well on fiberglass or even this foam. It tends to wear the tip down, so I kind of like to scribble on things just to keep them working. Now again, we'll just play connect the dots with our lines here, and that will establish our cut box. All right, so you can see out here in these corners, that is all the area that we want to trim out. So we'll get to that next. So now we're going to remove this foam, and the first thing I'm going to do is drill each one of these corners out so that I can get a saw blade in there to cut these lines. There is no good way to do this that I have found. If you use something like a cutoff wheel or even a Dremel, you run the risk of adding heat into this foam, which can damage it, which I don't want to do. If you use a power tool, even like a pneumatic air saw, you run the risk of damaging this foam. So by using, elbow power here and just a saw blade, I'm going to have to hand cut this out. And like I said, just to make it easier, I'm just going to drill out the corners to get it started. All right, so that's that part. And next comes the fun part. I find the down cuts to be much more difficult than the long cuts. So I'm going to start with those first, only because the more of this foam that's connected, the easier it is to cut. So I'm going to leave the last bit of cutting out here in the front where I can actually support it. So this one really sucks. I'm actually on the backside doing this to support it. If you're going to try this, be very careful you just don't rip through your finger. I mean, I've done it. Yeehaw. All right. So now we have a giant gaping hole in our panel, and all that work. Yep. Every time I do something like this, it always makes me kind of cringe. But it is what it takes. So our next step is I'll show you what the bracket looks like kind of in place with the sensor, so you get an idea of how it'll lay out. But the next step is going to be adding epoxy to this edge the whole way around. And the reason being is we want to seal off this foam that's inside here. You can see right now, I'll pinch it, still kind of spongy because I didn't totally, solidify this foam. I didn't want to. I wanted to wait until I actually fiberglass everything for it to soak. So what I did was, establish this harder inner and outer shell just to retain the shape. But we don't want to leave this open to the elements. And even if I do a trim panel in here, there's still a good chance that I'm not going to be able to make it, OEM watertight. So I don't want any kind of moisture, water, anything to be able to get into these edges that could deteriorate this panel over time. So there's two different ways we could do it. We could add fiberglass to this edge like I did on this top edge, Or we could simply add epoxy into these areas and that will weatherproof these edges. I'm going to go with epoxy only because this is not an area that anyone's ever really going to see. It's not really going to need sanded down. It's nothing that's really going to be, pretty. So we can get away with just using the epoxy here and then, let it dry, and then we'll be able to move on to bonding the panel. So we'll look at the bracket next. So here is the sensor and the bracket. I'll put it into place. And this is how it's going to sit, roughly like this. Now you can see if I hold this back, we'll just use it down here, you can see how far back that sits in. Now when I bring this flush, you can see where we are with the body panel. So bringing this out all the way to this level is why I needed, because I needed the distance right here. I'll show you. You can see right there that height, that's what I needed to protrude out through my fiberglass. Then I can just throw it up. So that essentially is how this thing will sit once we bond our fiberglass skin over this area. So next up is going to be adding the epoxy to this edge. For this step, I'm going to be using the same JB Weld epoxy that I've been using throughout this process. This is the end of this tube. I always pull the wrapper off just so I know when I'm getting to the end. My tool is actually an acid brush, but I crimped the end flat to kind of use it to scrape, along these edges. Again, the idea here is just to waterproof this edge. When I do my epoxy, I'm going to start with the top edge. Like most things, I don't like to fight gravity, so I'm going to start here. That way, if anything runs, I can smear it down, and put it into place. So we're just going to mix the rest of this epoxy, and I'm going to do 2 coats of this because I want to make sure that it is really, really, waterproof. But I'm only going to show one because to show it twice is just, repetitive and stupid. I'm just going to mix it all up. All right, then we're just going to scoop it, start spreading it. What I'm kind of doing at the same time, I'm pushing that epoxy up into that foam that's kind of virgin foam, it's not solidified in any way. And by doing that, I'm making sure it's penetrating, beyond the surface and deep inside. That's why I'm actually doing 2 rounds of it, because I want to make sure that not only is the top surface coated, but the actual foam, below the surface also has a good coat of this epoxy inside it. Make sure you pay attention to the corners. If you get some on the inside, it's not a big deal. This stuff can be, sanded down later on. If you get cracking like this out here, don't worry about it. We're going to bond something right over it anyway. So that's the end of this bit of epoxy. I'm going to have to go get more, and I'll stop the video here because you just get the point. But in essence, like, I'm going to finish this edge, and I'm going to go around everything one more time, and then I'm going to let it dry really good before I go ahead and bond my skin. All right, now I've solidified these edges here with that epoxy, and you can see it's very strong now. It's watertight. It's soaked in, you know, probably a good 1/8 of an inch below the surface here is where it's solid. So this is a very good seal here now. I don't have to worry about water getting in here at any point. Again, what we're going to be doing here is putting this piece on. And we're going to get to drilling this out here in a minute. But the first thing we're going to have to do is go back in here and deburr basically all this foam that's kind of sticking up. You can see some of it just comes right off. All this foam that's kind of just jagged edges from cutting it out. I'm just going to clean up these edges and then sand everything down so that this can sit nice and flat. Right now I've got like some spots here and here where it's sitting high because this material still needs to be sanded down. So we'll do that step next. Now, because we cut a 1/4 inch beyond the actual bracket, we don't have to worry about any of this really sticking up high. I don't want to sand on the edges too much just because I don't want to run the risk of opening up, you know, this foam. But like I said, we just want to clean up the inside, the outside here. We can get to the inside later on when we go to fiberglass. So we're just going to concentrate on the outside areas. I'm just going to use some sandpaper on my ruler, just a handy little, you know, tool real quick. We'll just sand this down and then we'll get on to drilling. I will say that this epoxy, when it dries, it's pretty darn strong. Excuse me. I'm sanding on this pretty hard, and it's, you know, it's not exactly easy to get off. So knowing that, you know, a lot of this stuff is bonded with this stuff, and the intention is not really to keep things held together temporarily, it's just permanently. It's just kind of a little peace of mind to know that, you know, when you're joining stuff together, that it's got some real strength to it. You know, like I said, just peace of mind. One thing you do want to be careful is, make sure that you don't sand off your alignment marks. I know that they run pretty far out, so I'm not too worried about it. And if you run them out pretty far and you do sand something off, you can always, grab your ruler and put it back on. But just make sure you don't permanently erase them, and then you're, going to be kind of screwed. So from here, all I'm going to do, now that I got all the big stuff off, is just scuff this outside area really good. I want to clean this and get it really, prepped so that when I bond the fiberglass to the foam here, that it's good and clean and we'll have a really good permanent bond. The nice thing about using this foam too is that cloth that's on the outside of the foam, when you sand it down, I mean, it gets really nice and smooth. And it's a good indicator so that when, you've got it down to where you want it. I'm gonna grab some new sandpaper. And that will about do it for the outside. The other thing I will recommend doing is, after you're done sanding, take your panel, line it back up and make sure that your marker is still visible. You can see right here, I kind of sanded on that a little bit. So what I'm going to do before we go to the next step is actually put that line back in, just to make it a little bit easier when we have to line this up. All right, so I just went ahead and drilled this hole out. I don't think anyone really needs to see me drilling out holes. We've all seen someone use a drill bit before. But I'm going to move on to our next step, which is to block sand this thing. Now, the reason we want to block sand this thing is because on the back side here, it's not exactly smooth. And this is now the mounting surface for that sensor bracket. So we want to make sure that this surface is leveled out, and number two, scuffed really good, because once this is bonded, I'm not going to be able to get back in here to clean up this fiberglass. And I want to make sure this fiberglass here is good and prepped so that when we go to put this sensor on here, we get a good bond, whether we're using tape or, epoxy to bond it permanently. So, like I said, I'm just going to take care of this step now so that down the road, we're not screwed. And just by scuffing it really quickly, you can see right here was where that aluminum tape was laid. So there's like ridges that I can catch with my fingernail right here. So this is what we want to take off so that this is nice and smooth all the way across. So that's basically how far I'm going to take it down. Some of these like spots right here, it's kind of a low spot. I'm not really worried about that low spot right here too much, because if I use an epoxy, it'll just, fill in. Really what I was more concerned about was the high spots that wouldn't allow the mounting bracket to sit, flat. So now we're just going to clean this and we can move on. So I'm going to clean this thing off now, and this is one of the very few times where I actually use alcohol as opposed to acetone when I'm cleaning fiberglass. The thing that I find with acetone, especially with something that is, paper thin, it tends to kind of make it, I don't know, if it's got, basically if the fiberglass has any kind of shape to it and you put acetone to it and it's really thin, the chances are that shape's going to kind of go away. It just kind of loosens everything up. So rubbing alcohol will kind of do the same thing, but in a much less degree. So this is, like I said, one of the very few times that I will clean something with rubbing alcohol as opposed to acetone when it comes to fiberglass. And you can do whatever you want, experiment around. It's just what I've found with working with fiberglass over the years. I just don't feel that rubbing alcohol cleans, the wax and everything that you get when you're dealing with fiberglass off as well as like acetone to strip it. But, like I said, in this instance, I don't want this to be, warped or destroyed in any way. So I'm just going to use rubbing alcohol. So now I'm going to go over to the car and wipe that down. And I'm just going to use rubbing alcohol again and just clean up that area that I already scuffed. When I come back, we will start the bonding process. All right, so this will be the last step here, and we're actually going to bond this. So the only thing that's really different in this step is I'm using this JB Weld clear, and it's a 5-minute set time. And the reason I'm using this as opposed to the 1 minute is that the 1 minute, you really don't have much time to work with it. And on top of that, it gets really tacky quick. This, I want to actually be able to move the panel around if I need to. So this really is kind of the best product that I found for this application. Plus, when you get all this epoxy around this edge, it actually strengthens this area quite a bit. So another good reason to use this. So we're just going to mix this up, and then I'll show you how I spread it, and then we will bond it. I like to use this little acid brush to do this part. I like to crimp the end to kind of make like a spade to kind of smooth out the epoxy. And then I can use the brush end to kind of, really get it anywhere I want it else. So, just a little trick. The other nice thing about using this 5-minute epoxy is that you don't have to worry about it setting really quick while you're mixing it. So you can actually take your time and make sure that it's thoroughly mixed. The 1-minute stuff, I find that if you spend way too much time mixing it, it will just kind of start to solidify you on you before you know it. So this is a little bit more forgiving, which I want for this. All right, so nice and good and mixed. So what I'm going to do here is take my little, my little tool here, and I'm just going to grab a bunch of it on the end. And then I'm just going to smear it. Kind of hard to do all this on camera, so I'm trying to do my best. There's really no good angles here that I can get, and I wish I had something, better to record with, but, it's what I got. Little tip, don't get this epoxy in the area that you want your sensor bracket to go into. Once it dry, if you get it in the area that you want that bracket to mount to, it's going to dry and it'll leave a hump and you'll have to go in there and try and take it out. So it looks like I got enough of this on here. I'm just going to spread it out. And if you get any bristles in there, don't worry, you can just get them right out. So I want it to be a good even layer. I don't want it puddled up. Looks pretty good. So if you get a bristle in it like I did there, just drag it out. That's that. Here comes the fun part. Now you'll see I have tape sitting right down here. I have this tape just pre-torn. I'm going to be using it to hold this in place as I go. Good idea to have that done, because this epoxy gets everywhere. So you can kind of see as I'm moving along here, that transparency, you can see that epoxy, really filling in. And that's really what I'm trying to do, is squeeze that, get that good bond in there. Right here, I'm really aligned good. So once I put a piece of tape down, I like to just go back over it and make sure my alignment marks are still where I like them. If they are, I just grab another piece of tape, and I usually go opposite corners. The epoxy, if it starts to seep out on you, I just spread it around. It is going to get all over you. It does come off. So now I'm going to work back down here. Everything's still looking good. Good. And I'm just going to put one up at the top. Now I can feel down in here that my panel, this fiberglass panel, wants to lift. So what I'm going to do is grab a paper towel, some alcohol. I'm going to clean this area really good, and then I'm going to run another piece of tape over this. And I'm just going to let it sit here for a second. All right, so we're just going to let this dry. Little tip, you don't want to let this dry like overnight. You want to let it sit for like 15 minutes or until the panel is permanently bonded. You don't want to leave this on overnight for sure. This will dry right to it. And then this aluminum tape is a real nightmare to try and get off. So from here, I have the other side of the car finished, and we'll go take a look at what it looks like with the sensor installed. So here is a really good look at the finished product and what we were going for. Now you can see, this sensor is now protruding, beyond the fiberglass. This panel is nice and bonded. It's doing pretty much everything that we needed it to do, and will be easy to cover, with fiberglass to finish it off. So let's look at the inside. All right, you can see on the inside here, I have the sensor and the bracket just taped in place. You can see how that cutout leaves plenty of room to move it around. You can see here how the bottom, now that foam closes it in. And way up top, that top piece of foam, now is covering it. So I'll be able to do, like I said, a trim panel right in this area to completely cover it off. So that's what all this hard work was to get those sensors just into this position. All right, so that's pretty much going to wrap it up for this episode. Hopefully you understood everything that I was doing here, and if you have any questions, please hit me up and let me know. If you find value in what I'm doing here, and you enjoy what I'm doing, please subscribe. And as always, we will catch you next time.